education and its financing.
Thanks very much. It's wonderful to be a part of this conversation, and you know, I've been scribbling on my pad here and circling and underlining so many things that I've heard this morning, but also so many things that we have learned even prior. I want to start in the year 1997, speaking of dating myself. I was at secondary school, and the current Prime Minister was the Minister of Education. And while she was Minister of Education, she started a program that much of the country thought was a little, I mean, I will admit, perhaps extremely futuristic and wondering where she was going with this. And it was called EduTech. And that was decades ago. And EduTech for Barbados meant to deliver what we are trying to deliver here today. And I start there because it is clear to me that while countries like Barbados and Namibia and others are beneficiaries, I think we're also pioneers, in that we saw this vision and we longed for these partnerships that we're seeing come to fruition now. So I first want to say thank you to Giga, to ITU, to UNESCO. As I was coming here, the Prime Minister said to me, you know, we have a history of really strong partnership with UNESCO, and we really need to kind of reignite that. And so that's a part of my mandate as I'm here, so you get to hold me accountable to that. But it is a real pleasure to be able to see all of this come full circle from the EduTech days to now. EduTech was not as successful as it might have been. And you make a very important point, because Prime Minister tells the story often of how she had to fight with the Ministry of Finance. I know she is the Minister of Finance. To be able to get the financing and to make a case. And it is unthinkable that you would have to make this case, right? To take students into the future of technology and connectivity and learning. She saw many years ago where it was going, and here we are today. But I'm really thrilled to be able to respond to the question of the need for system-wide transformation in education, because that's where Barbados finds itself now. We've actually, since 2022, but really our mandate started in 2018, been in this process of education transformation. And it is every ball in the air at once when it comes to education. So it is really restructuring, quite frankly, a post-colonial system which saw education being made available to certain students, certain people with certain means, and in some way that has cascaded down to a situation where there's education available for all, but the system that we use to transition from the primary to the secondary level is still quite stratified, I would say. And we have these, what we call older secondary schools, and they're older because literally that they came from a place where only kind of the landed gentry and they would be able to send their children to these schools. And then eventually we change the stratification to a certain kind of learner. So you go and you take an exam on one day, and if you're a good exam taker in math and English, then you get to go to one of these schools. And if you learn in any other way, or if you woke up with a headache that day, then you are directed to another set of schools. When I was working with the Prime Minister 7 years ago on what the education pathway might look like, I said to her, we have to make every school a top school, because that's the language of Barbadians, right? She went to a top school. So I said, let's make every school a top school. And we'll know that by the learning outcomes on the other side. It won't be about whether the school is in Bridgetown or whether the school is an older school or existed for 300 years, but we'll know that from the outcomes. And so what we're trying to do now is to change that entire stratified system, literally, to be able to introduce primary, middle schools, where we focus a little bit more on building out some core capacities and competencies, and then go on to secondary schools that start at a later time, and infuse through all of that early childhood education straight through to tertiary education, which is all paid for by government, to infuse through all of that access to technology and to connectivity, but meaningful connectivity. To be able to say, well, what are students using this connectivity for? I also want to comment on something that I would encourage us, as Karen, you intimated earlier, to look at connecting schools, yes, but to look beyond that at connecting students. Because students occupy schools for part of the day. And really we want connectivity and the ease and the digital literacy to be taken from students with them from school into their homes and then to be transferred to their families. One of the things we find is that if you want families, parents, grandparents, children that are younger, to be able to adopt digital literacy as a language, then we need to use students who are of school age to take that home with them. We see the same thing with things like climate. We found that if we want to change behavior in terms of how people use energy efficiently, or whether people litter or not, that if a child feels passionate about that message, they take that message home. And we see the change going not necessarily from parent to child, but on these newer issues from child to parent. And so for us, the connectivity is schools very, very important, because we know that some students will only get connectivity or will be introduced to connectivity when they get to school. But we want them to take it home with them. During COVID, we started an initiative in Barbados to put a tablet in the hands of every single student, because we were quite frankly terrified what the educational outcomes would look like on the other side of that. We've done some work and we see that what we expected has happened. Perhaps not, the outcomes were not as bad as they would have been if we hadn't found a kind of a second best system to be able to deliver education remotely. But we realize that there is such a tremendous learning gap from those COVID years that our education system now has to pivot completely to be able to recover from those learning losses. And we are right now in our education transformation trying to build in those learning losses into the curriculum that we are changing and evolving. The other thing, and I don't know if Emma, my colleague from Namibia, will be able to make it today, but I've stolen a little piece of her question in case she doesn't. And to say a little bit about what you frame as, and I really think that you all have framed these issues so well, and in your slide we see the interconnectivity, but what you framed as a whole of government approach to school connectivity. And we know that we need a whole of government approach, but I think we need a whole of country approach to school connectivity, because what we're working on now is that mapping that you talked about, Alex. We have a lot of data that supports that mapping. So for example, we know where every school is. I mean, Barbados is 170,000 people, so that's not that difficult. You can point each of you in the direction of the school. We know where every school is. Each school has a building ID. Each school is identified according to its vulnerability, hurricanes, the climate, to flooding, to other disasters. So we've done a lot of work to be able to do that mapping and do that mapping of fiber optic cable as well, because Barbados has one of the highest penetrations and rollouts of fiber optic cable. And so we've been working with the telecoms companies to say, look, this is a public-private third sector partnership. We need all hands on deck for this. But there's something else that I want to bring into this whole of country approach, which is, Jonas, you talked earlier about the startup mentality. And I think that you were talking about Giga having a startup mentality. But I think that we are trying to build out in our country a startup mentality when it comes to data and technology. We are building a data center. And we just started the work to do that because Barbados considers that data and technology have to be the new industry. I mean, it's the new currency. And so it has to be the core of a new industry. But we're doing that to be able to drive an ecosystem of startups and businesses that are able to use data to do research and development, but also to create data products. In order to do that, as soon as we start with formal education at 3 years old, which is when it starts in Barbados formally, and well, we start at pre-primary as well, which is also something I'll come to in the last 10 seconds. But what we realize is that we have to start that pipeline of talent from there. So really what we're doing is building a startup mentality in the whole country. You know, we're trying to connect access to technology and meaningful connectivity to what those students do. We need to raise data scientists. We need to raise people who are curious about information. We need to raise people who are fearless about starting things and failing. And that requires not just a whole of government approach, but it requires a whole of country approach. Because we also need to teach parents that if your child fails at a project, that's just the first failure, and that's fine. Barbados is a bit traditional in the sense that we like to pass exams. And that is quite frankly a part of the culture. And I think that this work is about being able to transform that alongside the education transformation that we're doing. So Giga for us is a dream realized. But we also want to be very active partners with you in showing some of the things that we've learned, in being able to share with our colleagues some of the things that we are already doing. And, you know, even up to the university, we think that we need to be able to have a certain level of technology transfer as well, so that people who are working on products can see a path to be able to convert these into a market, have global penetration with their products, and to see how this works. So we're really excited about the partnership going forward. We think that there's so much that we can do. We think this is something that has energized the country, quite frankly. And we're happy to see where it leads. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks. I think Leia's presentation reminded me of our experience with COVID and the fact that teachers were so very invested in making sure learners had good outcomes, but themselves did not have the adequate training, certainly had the will, but in some cases did not have the adequate training to be able to deliver that. And so just like Brazil has done, and just like is recommended from our partners in Giga, as part of our education transformation, they would recommend to any country on this pathway that teachers also have to be quite central in their capacity, not just to have digital skills, but to have the foundations that they need to deliver learning, right? Because what we find sometimes is that we put technology on top of systems that aren't functioning well. And teachers need some basics in the classroom, and they also need digital skills. So I think that's one of the lessons for us that I'd like to share.